Well, welcome to the Pharmaceuticals Journal's panel discussion on medicines, innovation and the value of medicines. We've got a great panel here today. We're going to be discussing how society should value medicines. I'm Elizabeth Suker, the Deputy News Editor on the Journal, and I'm moderating this session. So, as we all know, some drugs have a very hefty price tag. Take Kadcyla, for instance, the breast cancer treatment, which can cost up to £90,000 per patient, and yet will provide you an extra 6 months of life. Or the new exciting treatment, Sovaldi, which is a treatment for hepatitis C. We've seen that, eradicate the virus in 95% of cases. Again, quite expensive at £70,000 for a 24-week course. So are these drugs worth their high price? This topic is a hot one at the moment, as we've seen with the Cancer Drugs Fund. It axed 16 drugs recently, this month, and timely too. The government's review into medicines, known as the Accelerated Access Review, is posting next month, I believe, interim findings, and that is its aim is looking at how you can speed up access to innovative medicines. So I just want to encourage you to tweet in this session. Our hashtag is PJPanel15. I'm now going to introduce our panelists, and they will speak for 2 minutes on how society should value medicines and fund costly medicines. To my immediate left, we have Mindet Boyson, who is the Program Director of Technology Appraisals at NICE. He is also responsible for NICE's Patient Access Schemes Liaison Unit and the Highly Specialized Technologies Program. Mindet qualified as a pharmacist in the Netherlands and has held positions in industry and the King's Fund. Next to him is David Watson, who is the Director of Pricing and Reimbursement at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. He is primarily responsible for the 2014 Pharmaceutical Price Regulation Scheme, which basically covers the majority of branded drugs sold to the NHS, and he has spent much of his career with Pfizer. Next to him is Eric Lowe, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Myeloma UK. Eric spends much of his time campaigning on behalf of myeloma patients for the best standards of treatment, as well as developing strategies to remove barriers that are slowing down access to treatments. And Jane Lawrence, who wears 2 hats. She's the Chief Scientist at the Royal Pharmaceutical Society and the Professor of Biophysical Pharmaceutics at King's College London. Her area of expertise includes pharmaceutical science, which particularly drug and gene therapy. Jane is a pharmacist who has spent a majority of her career in academic pharmacy. And finally, but not least, we have Andrew White, who will hopefully give us the NHS perspective. He's the head of medicines optimization at the Greater Manchester Shared Service. His team provides strategic support to all the CCGs in the Greater Manchester area, which serves 2.8 million people. He has worked in clinical and managerial roles, as well as a community pharmacist. So Mindet, if you can start us off, how should society value medicines and fund costly medicines?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak. I am a pharmacist, although I probably am not allowed to practice it anymore after so many years out of it. And I've got a fan club in the right, for you, the left-hand corner, some committee members of NICE appraisal committees and one of our associate directors. So I have to be careful what I say. That's, I guess, in general the case. And I'm trying to make the 2 minutes go quickly by saying nothing, which is a very good thing at NICE. We are very good at this bit. No, so if you ask how should we, that's a normative question, and I guess the first return question is who decides? So is it NICE that decides how we should do this? Well, we do think we have a role, particularly around the process. So we are very keen to make the process about how you value medicines clear, transparent, inclusive, involves patients, clinicians, pharmacists, health economists, and those that are interested in the medicine themselves, the pharmaceutical industry. We think it should be done by one organization, and we realize that that's quite an ask. At the moment, there's many organizations looking at medicines. We're only looking at about 40 a year, and these are specialized services, medicines mostly. So for community pharmacists, we're not really dealing with a lot of the work you might be doing. I guess there's clinical pharmacists in the room as well. On the methods, which is the kind of hot potato in this debate, we use cost per quality. That is from 1999, our preferred method. We came to it because it was used already in the kind of health technology assessment arena in the UK. we've never gone away from it because it works quite well. We provide positive recommendations on about 80% of the medicines we look at. So it seems to be a system that works. We spend a lot of time working with people in this field to improve on what we do, and we consult every 3 years on our methods. At the moment, maybe that's a bridge to the ABPI colleague. At the moment, much of what is concerned, the real value of a QALY is unlocked in the pharmaceutical pricing regulation scheme. So the Department of Health and Industry have agreed that we use a certain threshold. So in a way, it's industry and the government that decide the value.
Going to have to stop you. I'm afraid you've gone over. Okay, and now, David, please tell us how can you answer that question?
Okay, well, it's like this old television quiz show where we had to follow on from the conversation from the previous person. So we recognise this is an extremely complicated issue because, as you started off saying, I think there's a strong view that a lot of new medicines might be very good, but might also be very expensive, and I think we completely get that. And we also have to recognise, in some cases, the pricing of new medicines just isn't right. I think the solution to all of this, though, is in a number of areas. First of all, I think we have to recognise what the nature of the problem is, because actually in the UK we do use quite a lot of medicines. I would suggest we tend to use older medicines very well, but we don't use newer medicines at all well, or often not in the right way to get the right outcomes. So I think that's problem number one. Problem number two is we can't always get our heads around the fact there may be a value in using a medicine over a period of a number of years, and we tend to look at it in terms of a one-off cost impact, and that makes it extremely difficult to decide whether something's worth using. And I think problem number three is, frankly, we don't live in a joined-up system. So for the system to really operate, to get its head around how to deal with affordability, I think the whole thing needs to be much, much more joined up, much more coherent than it is today.
Thank you. That's 1 minute 24 seconds. Well done. Okay.
Well, I'll lend some of his minutes.
Thank you. And Eric, please.
Yeah. So but it's hard to disagree with what's been said. So I might do it in 1 minute 20 seconds. So I think the system is complex, and I think the system doesn't really exist. I think different stakeholders, upstream and downstream, are working and thinking in isolation. I think you've seen over the last couple of years how awful it's been trying to come up with policy that tries to balance that tension between demand-driven healthcare from clinicians and patients and suppliers who often have very, very expensive drugs, but not often the data and the information that's appropriate for NICE and others to make good decisions. And that's been the major barrier for us, is that we can see the clinical benefit of a drug, but there's a really hefty price tag on one side, and there's data that comes from phase 3 licensing studies to prove safety and efficacy on the other, and that's not really what we need. We need data to help make good HTA in commissioning decisions. But it isn't just about getting access, it's about making sure we get to use the medicines in innovative ways in the clinic. And I think we do that pretty badly in the UK. We have one-size-fits-all averaged outcomes type algorithms that really dumb down innovation in the clinic with an obsession around taking costs out of the system. And I think we'll spectacularly fail to use our money well and improve outcomes as a result. So I think there's a huge amount of work to do. I think the AAR potentially is our best bet at the moment, but I think somehow we'll fall short of the type of discussion and the type of reform we need in the system in the UK to balance out all the different agendas that we have.
Thank you, Eric. And Jane?
Okay, I'm going to try and put some other views, because I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. Firstly, I think there's insufficient public discussion of this issue. People don't understand. I mean, we all read the Daily Mail, we all know what they think about NICE, but I think if you explain to people what we're trying to do, people are sensible and do actually understand. And I've spoken to school children who themselves actually in a class develop the equivalent of a QALY, because they realise we have to share things out. The other thing I think we have to think about is making sure we don't disincentivise industry, because I think it's actually very hard for industry to make any money. So often they may be developing a drug and somebody else beats them to the market, and all that money is lost in that drug development, which makes the subsequent drugs more expensive. So I really think we've got to be much more careful how we ensure that industry keep on coming up with the goods. Okay.
Thank you, Jane. And Andrew?
Thank you. So I guess I get the NHS world. NICE have a really hard job because they're trying to do rational rationing. And the qualities is what they've picked. But NICE deals in cost effectiveness, but a lot of the NHS works in affordability, which is a different thing. So you can prove something is cost effective, but we would love to use it, but sometimes there is insufficient money in the pot. So if I give you, where I work, Greater Manchester, we're 5% of the UK population, but we spend almost 6% of the UK spend on drugs. Is that because we get increased need, or is that because of poor variation? So value is not just, if I asked each of you what value was, you'd probably come up with a different answer, because it's quite a personal thing, so we have to use some way of measuring it. So if we look at our spend across Greater Manchester, it's £830 million on drugs. We project that at current growth rates forward 5 years, that's 1.3 billion. That's 500 million more than now. Can't afford that, or if we are to afford that, we need to decide what we're not going to do, or make some prioritisation choices. There are some fabulous new drugs out there, but some are new and shiny, but they're not always better. Some are. But how do we make sure we pick the right ones and make sure the right ones get used? And I just come back to the thing, for me, value is about outcomes. Outcomes for real people. At the moment, the model is that we buy things and we hope that they achieve a good outcome, but we don't know if they will. I'd love to shift them completely. So instead of us buying pills, we buy patient outcomes.
Thank you. David, do you think, NICE rejections, the cancer drug fund rejections, do you think these sort of decisions affects research? It impacts on research and development and innovation? Have you seen that from your industry members?
Well, we have to bear in mind, although we all like to think that the UK is an extremely important place to be, but for most companies in the pharma sector, it's a very small part of their worldwide operation. It's a very small part of their business. In the past, the UK has been a great place to do business, and it's been a home of some fantastic research. I think the dialogue and the partnership between industry and the rest of society and government and the NHS is at risk, if I'm honest. I think we do need to find a new a sort of systematic review of how things work, because I think industry gets some mixed signals about how we adopt new medicine. It is frankly very confusing for industry to work in the UK at the moment, and we really hope as part of the accelerated access review that the government will look at this and sort of reflect again on how should we be adopting new technologies in a much more systematic way than we are at the moment.
Thank you. How about you, Eric? What's your view on that? Do you think it affects innovation and rationing?
Yeah, potentially. So I've just come back from Switzerland, 2 days in Switzerland, 2.5 days meeting with a big pharmaceutical company. It was a very fortuitous timing because it was on the back of the CDF delisting last week. And their EMEA president pulled me in and said, that's it, we're deprioritising the UK and pulling out. I said, why would you do that? That's a crazy business decision. Really short-sighted. I said, I'm an averagely smart layperson earning no money in comparison to you, and that's the worst business decision I've ever heard in my life. And I explained why. And I don't need to explain to you why it is. But this is a great place to do business, and I think that all markets are going to be hostile downstream from here. If you can work out how to be successful in the UK, that's going to make you really robust and have the stamina and the vision to survive downstream from now, because all markets are going the same way. At the end of the 2-day trip, they pulled me in again and said they're going to change their mind. Not only going to stay in the UK, they're going to prioritise the UK. But it does impact on research, academic research. We run an early phase clinical trial network. We've got 35 hospitals. We're on a portfolio of 13 studies. And this merry-go-round of what your comparator is impacts on research. And we've seen NICE appraisals fall foul because we keep changing the comparator. We're setting up academic studies that are really meaningful. It's the studies that matter in the NHS best interests. Then we have to shut them down because some craziness goes on somewhere else in the system and your comparator disappears. So there's no question all this nonsense is impacting on research, And that actually is costing us more money than what we think we're saving by taking costs out of algorithms. It's really
Thank you,
crazy.
Eric. So the Cancer Drugs Fund, as we know, was set up to fund these costly drugs. Now it's massively overspent. So Mindet, is it sustainable? Do you think the industry has priced itself out of the fund?
Yeah, well, the easy answer is none of our business really at the moment. It's a decision by government to pay for drugs to which we've said no. Do we see a future for something of a fund for cancer drugs? Yes, but it has to be on a different footing. One, it has to represent potential value, so it can't be at all costs. Drugs need to at least prove that they are in scope of what we consider reasonable. Then we do believe that there's probably a period in which we have to explore its use of a medicine in the NHS. And rationing sounds like 0-1 game. And I think people who read the Daily Mail would think that NICE is simply a 0-1 game, yes or no. We think there's a lot more scope for in the middle. NICE as an enabler, NICE supporting the NHS in adopting medicines and tracking their worthwhile over time.
But NICE will be taking over the fund eventually in April, I believe. Is that right? And so how should it be reformed, in your opinion? I mean, the way they do their scoring system at the moment has been criticised. I mean, do we bring it into the fold as to how NICE measures?
Well, the scoring system is not unreasonable. It's what doctors think is acceptable. And we're not really yet announcing that we're taking anything over. That's for the government to decide. We're happy to support whoever runs that fund in making the right decisions. We think it's about managing access rather than rationing.
Okay. David, do you think industry's priced itself out of the fund?
Maybe some have, but I'd say overall industry hasn't. I think industry's frustrated with the existence of the Cancer Drugs Fund. I think it's a shame in a way that the debate is so focused on the Cancer Drugs Fund. I think with NICE's greater ability in future to sort of be able to assess medicines according to a whole number of criteria would be a better way to go. I think at the moment it is slightly unfair on other sort of disease areas that don't have the equivalent of the Cancer Drugs Fund, because I'm not sure it's the best use of resources overall.
And Andrew, you surely must be seeing this in CCGs. I mean, what did in your CCGs in your area think of these this cull of these cancer drugs? I mean, sense of relief that they weren't really effective anyway?
Some of them might say, well, it's all NHS England commission, so it's none of our business. But actually their population, it doesn't matter whether you get cancer or another condition, it's about you look after your population, you look after your people. And to pick up the points, I think, why do we single out the cancer and the Cancer Drug Fund only? There are other very worthy conditions which don't have that same support. Equally, there's other areas where there's no NICE guidance. So how do you compare breastfeeding, for example, with a drug that's been NICE TA'd? Because they could have equal or greater value, but the NHS is mandated to implement technology appraisals, but it's not mandated to do these other things. And it could be for your population, the priority is how you see it, but you're derailed by some other outside force. So, I think an ability to, we may be in the eye of the storm in Greater Manchester, we may get stuff delegated to us. That is, the Cancer Drug Fund is unclear, but certainly lots of specialised commissioning. We will be co-commissioned with NHS England. And I think a lot of it's how you implement it. It's not about the policy, it's how you implement it to the best effect for your people.
Sorry, Andrew. And Eric, I mean, you saw 2 drugs taken off the fund. How did patients respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously patients are devastated, but like you say, I mean, I think patients understand the issues. It's not what it in the Daily Mail. They get it, and we do them a disservice by thinking that they don't. And this may come as a surprise from, well, I'm essentially a patient advocate, is that the Cancer Drugs Fund was a policy anomaly. We were never, ever in favour of the Cancer Drugs Fund, and I think the government failed to understand the issues. And if you don't understand the issues, you can't come up with the right solution. And I think the CDF has not been the right solution, and we've wasted 5 years messing around with a fund that was only going to head to where it is at the moment. And I think what we should have done is, sit down with NICE and say, what are the issues? Why are NICE saying no to cancer drugs? And if you ask that question, it's really clear. And then from there, you can start to think about how you might get really meaningful and sustainable solutions that's about not just mitigating the risk of the adoption of innovation after NICE, but through the whole clinical development process. We have to improve the inputs into the system. And until we do that, no amount of stick and plaster policy at the other end is going to make any real difference. And I think that's been a huge opportunity missed to really connect the system. And I really support this notion, for me, that all roads lead to NICE. I think with a appropriately evolved remit, I think they're perfectly placed to look downstream to suppliers, upstream to payers, and bring them together in a meaningful environment.
And Jane, what do you think of the Cancer Drugs Fund and the recent cuts?
I like some of the other speakers said, I think it's very unfair to single out cancer when there are other equally well-deserving conditions that possibly could be even treated even better. I agree as well, going into NICE would be a big advantage in the future.
Okay. What about the Cancer Drugs Fund from your point of view, David? I mean, was it a bad idea to start off with?
As other colleagues have said, it was a political idea. I think it served a purpose for a while, but I think we'd all hope that there'd be further reform to move towards more of a stable routine commissioning platform for new drugs. And maybe, I mean, the one feature of the Cancer Drugs Fund which I think we did see as potentially an advantage is the idea of having available funds to sort of kickstart new medicines, but that shouldn't just apply perhaps to cancer, that should be for other medicines that are sort of really transformative.
Okay, if we can move the discussion now to the accelerated access review. So the findings, initial findings, interim findings next month. From the industry's point of view, I mean, what changes would you like to see, David?
Well, we recognise that I think the AAR starts out with a great idea, which is that we like to believe that we work in a fully integrated healthcare system. I think to pick a couple of themes that we're interested in, one is I think to recognise that there is a problem of uptake of a very transformative, is a term that's been used, technologies that make a real difference still aren't used as early as they could be. So there is a problem. And it's not just about money, it's about culture and process and systems. So I think we're looking forward to seeing how the review grasps the nettle on that issue and hopefully creates a political will and a will with the NHS to understand the issue and to try and resolve it.
So, I mean, the review is looking at different funding models, and when I had a chat with you, Mindet, about this, that you were saying to me that one idea on the table is having different prices for different indications. Can you talk us through that?
Well, I think at the moment, everything seems to be focusing on quite bureaucratic solutions. So solutions around pricing or the interaction between industry and NICE. But I think there's a lot more creativity in the system. And I think every pharmacist in this room would understand that perhaps different indications should be rewarded with different prices. Now, every pharmacist in the room would say they couldn't cope with that kind of system because the invoice would only allow one medicine to be priced at one price because you couldn't differentiate between indications. And this is the real issues that we constantly hear, that creativity cannot be supported by the NHS. Patient access schemes, the biggest moan ever, comes from the NHS saying, oh, don't come with a patient access scheme because we couldn't handle the administrative burden of it. I think that's the wrong approach. You should be accommodating, not you personally, but the NHS should be accommodating creativity. And yes, it will be more work, but you should be valued for that work. And don't rely on NICE and the interaction between NICE and industry to only solve the issue through a cost per quality debate. And I think the AAR will show that that actually isn't where the debate will go. It will go to you, to the NHS, where it has to happen.
So with the patient access schemes, and when they first started out, I always thought they were kind of going to be the exception to the rule. But now they are so common, and they have these confidential drug prices.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how successful have they been? Maybe I'll get Andrew to answer that from your point of view.
I think you're right, the proliferation of different schemes, the fact they're all not all the same, it is administratively really tricky. I think the NHS would just prefer the list price to be lower and keep it simple and not have rebate schemes or other complex things, but define what that right value is. I guess, not to not answer your question, but you've got to come back to what's the purpose of this? The purpose of this is to make people, patients, places better places to be. So that might be that, you know, I know a PCT before they were closed that bought front doors and and double glazing for people, because that was the thing that was most important to them, to feel secure and warm. Now that's their outcome that they wanted. It wasn't a drug, it wasn't to go into the doctor, it wasn't to take 15 medicines, it was to feel safe and secure and healthy. Now that is something that the health system can't deal with, but it's about how health and social care coming together could be better. So you're right, we could lay this all at farmers' door, but I think pharmacists could be the answer, because how do you get people through the minefield? You actually have an expert to help you, and these are the sorts of people who could very ably do that.
But would it be fair to say that the industry likes patient access schemes because it kind of protects their prices? It's not out in the open, and it protects that whole international reference pricing.
We live in a
problem,
global
like
market.
David
We're only
just answered
3% of the world's sales, but we're a price-setting market for about 30 to 40% of the world. So actually we have to be realistic that that's the world we live in, so we need to find the simplest way of doing it to make sure that most people benefit. We may not have it right now, but I'm quite happy to have the debate to try and get it better.
So David, the industry likes the patient access schemes.
Well, I wouldn't say we like them, but I think we recognise that they have a place for some medicines. But I think to the point about the UK, we have a set of sort of published list prices in the UK, which more often don't reflect the actual costs that the NHS pays. And I think we'd probably like to move more towards a model where there's a pricing discussion at a national level, in parallel perhaps with the conversation with NICE, and then we cut out what is currently enormous duplication of negotiation throughout the system, which I think has created a system where it's just not, pricing isn't opaque at all.
How about you, Eric? What do you think of these patient access schemes?
Well, we were at the table back in 2004-05 with the Velcade response scheme, so we were really pushing for a way to try and address the tension between the uncertainty and payers. And it was actually our suggestion, well, why don't you come up with a way to manage that risk? Because if you buy a car and it's got a 6 out of 10 chance of not getting home to your driveway, why would you buy it? And I think that gave the different parties the impetus to have the discussion. But I think that for us, they should be the exception, not the rule, actually. And I think the longer we continue to need to rely on patient access schemes means we've still not fixed and understood the problem. And I think whatever we think about today, we have to future-proof it. It always seems to me we're 5 or 10 years behind on our solutions. And you've got to think about what's happening globally. There's a huge downward pressure on price everywhere, even in the US. The boardrooms of drug companies in which I are fortunate enough to kick the door down and sit round, they're all saying the same things. So I think it's a direction of travel of the world, and I don't think the UK is going to be out of sync for too much longer with the rest of the world. So whatever we decide today needs to be future-proof. And so that's definitely one thing. But I do agree, I mean, we've got to keep it simple, and I think there's a tendency to layer complexity on top of complexity, but we need to be agile and dynamic and responsive and much, much more creative than we are, especially the bit after NICE. And that's where you can make the biggest difference in terms of improving patient outcomes. And we're really bad at doing it, and I think Mindert's right. I think that's where we'll see the AAR shining a bright torch on how we can do things differently within the NHS to balance out this need to what seems like cut costs, but actually it's what you say. How do we buy better outcomes for patients?
Well, we've all talked about the quality, and that's kind of the big kind of elephant in the room. And so, are there better evaluation models out there to the quality, in your opinion, being in this area for so many years? That can
It really depends on the system. I mean, there's lots of countries in Europe that use affordability, and you've heard the word 3 times already here. So it seems when affordability wasn't an issue for many years for NICE, that might need to become an issue. And we've seen with hepatitis C that we can say that these drugs are cost effective. The NHS will not respond. They rather not buy them if they have to spend so much money. So I think it can't be the only answer, and in highly specialized technologies, a program we run, so this is for ultra-orphan diseases, it probably isn't the right tool, and we've recognized that, and we use different methods of conversation. But again, back to who decides, we need to know from NHS England how much they want to spend on what. That's in the end really the point. NHS England, CCGs, are the ones that should tell us. and this is the Cancer Drugs Fund issue, is that we can do whatever they like, as long as they tell us what they want to achieve.
David, do you want, or Eric?
But the problem with that is, I think, is what they've told you to do in the past isn't right.
No, I agree,
So-
but they
so I
have a
think
process of engagement with people
Yeah.
in which they ask the question. But have you ever heard anybody at NHS England ask the question of the public?
No.
What
I think-
should we value? Who
Yeah.
is worth what? Should we fund cancer or chronic diseases or ophthalmology? They don't ask that question to anybody. I don't think. Not so.
So this
clearly.
is my fear, is that they're going to keep asking you to do things that don't make any sense because they don't understand what they're doing, and we need to buck that trend pretty quickly. We don't have too many more months or years to do it. And I think, again, we need a different broker. We need an honest broker in the system that can actually take us to a place that we all want to be. And I think this current government, or any government, can't be trusted to give us the policy levers in which to do things that need to be done.
Thank you. This is kind of a question kind of on the side, but under the PPRS scheme, David, the industry has to make a rebate, and I think this year it's going to be like £800 million, which is quite a lot of money. So, I mean, I'd like to hear what the panel thinks where this money should go. I mean, is it clear? Is it going to medicine or just to HM Treasury, David?
So, industry has has a deal with Department of Health, and it's a deal between industry and Department of Health, and not industry and NHS. Have to be clear. But yeah, you're right. Over the life of the schemes, about £4 billion worth of payments are made back, which essentially is through a mechanism of agreeing to underwrite the growth in branded medicines. So the money is only paid when there has been growth, and then we pay the difference back. We would think that the money should go back into the health service and probably go back to level in the health service where people can see that any overspend has been sort of adjusted for. At the moment, that hasn't happened. So I think within the life of the scheme, which still has another 3 years to run, we'd like to see, I think, a more ambitious and useful way to use the money that's been paid back.
How about, the CCGs, what would you think, Andrew? Should the money go back specifically for medicines or just to health?
We'd like an itemised bill. We'd like to understand what's going on, because at the moment it's in the allocation. As we're told everything, it's in the allocation. So most CCGs get a 1.7% increase last year, unless they were behind the curve. We don't know how much of that was PPRS, we don't know how much of that was drugs, etc. We'd like to, almost ring fence that to be able to, because at the moment we get an average. So if my area does lots of innovative stuff, we only get the average back. We don't get a rebate on the really good stuff that we do. So we could be double innovative to other places, but if some places half as innovative, we still get the same rebate back, and we don't get it locally. We'd like to say, if you spend the money in our patch, you get the money back in our patch, so we can truly make an investment decision in, let's use this good stuff because we know it's going to work, and really pull behind it, and then we have that sort of that risk and reward, which is joint with the industry, so that we can say, we'll do more of this, and if it achieves more, great. If it doesn't, then actually we've got that balancing off.
Thank you. And Eric, did you want to say something on this?
It's always confused me, the rebate thing, and nobody but the Treasury has given me a sort of sensible answer to it, because they're confused about why they're being asked to put this money back in the system, because it's not new money. It's money that already has been spent. The only new money in the system is the agreed growth 1.7, 2.7. Everything above that that's rebated, according to the Treasury, is just paying off debt, right? Because you've spent the money already. So unless they've already agreed to an equivalent increase in the budget of the rebate amount, then there is no new money. And that's why the Treasury are confused about why they're always being asked to put this money back into the system. It's the rebate is paying the money that's already been spent.
And Jane, just to go back to the question of innovation then, what do you think needs to be done to support innovation in academia and industry?
Okay, that's a really good question. It depends what you mean by innovation. I think that's actually quite an emotive, I don't know if you hear me, that's actually quite an emotive word, because I don't really fully understand what innovation is. I don't know whether most people in the room do either. But if you're talking about actually encouraging people to come up with ideas, new ways of doing things, I think you've actually got to get rid of a lot of the restrictions that are already there to give them the freedom. to go ahead and do that. So for there's a number of things that actually not very helpful that stop people doing things. Give an example around repurposing and drug rescue, for example. At the moment, if a company decides to do look at some old drugs or possibly repurpose an existing drug, they can't get any patent life on that. So the only thing they can actually get is exclusivity if they actually go ahead and get a marketing authorization. Well, that's not very inventive for people to go back and spend a lot of money re-looking at old drugs, and yet that's potentially quite a cheap way of getting new medicines.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I think I'm going to open the floor now to questions from the audience. It's been a stimulating debate. Thank you.
I'm Anthony McCord from Belfast Trust and Health and Social Care, Northern Ireland. I work in cardiac thoracic surgery, but I think quite a few years back there was a lot of work done with Lucentis. I was just wondering what the panel thought of Avastin then being the branded product, costing a lot more than the agent that was used for in the trials.
Would you like
Yeah, well, it's kind of a live debate. So within technology appraisals, we can only appraise licensed medicines. And the reason for that is that we are being given the topics by the minister, and the minister cannot afford referring a unlicensed medicine to NICE. It would because the minister is also responsible for licensing, so it would be rather odd to ask that question. Now there are others interested in the debate around which of the two medicines for a wet AMD you should use, bevacizumab or ranibizumab, and I think there's a guideline around this in the consideration at NICE to help doctors think about the subject. Now that's again tricky because as an organization we wouldn't want to undermine the regulatory system with our guidance, but we recognize this is a real key issue and we're hoping to provide some answers. But that's as far as we've ever gone.
Yes, Andrew, please.
We can sometimes get hung up on the price of the drug. If you're looking at wet AMD, which is essentially very quick progressive blindness, and then you put an injection in somebody's eye, the drugs are very expensive, but actually it's the whole package of that care. And actually what we found is that while the drug is really expensive, we actually haven't got enough ophthalmologists, we haven't got enough diagnostic capacity, we haven't got enough stuff to get people through the system, because 10 years ago we didn't inject people's eyes at all. So it's a perfect example of a really innovative technology that could have been done so much better. What we've done is we've levered it into the existing pathway rather than thinking this should just be broken up completely and started again. You know, innovation is probably the second most abused word in the NHS behind transformation, because nobody actually does much that changes very much. We all take little steps, but we've got the opportunity with things like that to say, well, let's do the scans in community optometrists. Let's have a quick scan that sends up to the consultant and fast access. In India, they line people up and just do that. And that gets through patients really quickly, but we have the issue of the tariff. We have systems which don't help some of that. So we would dearly love to say, use the drugs, but it's not £700 for the drug, it's actually £1,500 for that patient contact. Look at the whole thing, don't just look at the drug cost, and that will solve your problem.
Fantastic. Eric, did you want to say anything to that? No. Any other questions? Oh, great. So the lady on the same table. Thank you. Again, name and title and organisation.
Okay, thank you. My name is Li Jia Chen from University of Nottingham. I was interested in the question Eric just mentioned before about when we're talking about praising the new technologies or medicines. The system is complex, and Eric mentioned there's no system existing anyway. But you do mention about when we try to appraise those technologies, the data information just not there. From my point of view, I just saw majority of the decision making is always based on imperfect information anyway. So to what extent do you think, what kind of information we need and how quick we should get it through, and how would that inform the decision making?
Yeah, so So we're huge advocates of thinking differently about how we generate information and evidence. And I think, you know, most of the myeloma appraisals that we've been through with NICE and SMC and with All Wales Medicine Strategy Group have been kind of flawed because of the way that clinical research is done by industry, because their job is to get a license in a global market. And I think they've been slow to realise that actually that's not the final hurdle anymore. HTA and payers are. And I think the drug development model in industry is not adaptive and agile enough to think about strategic markets and microenvironments. And that's why we pioneered our clinical trial network. I mean, the idea came out of the Velcade appraisal back in 2006. People said we were completely mad to do it. It took me about 3 or 4 years to even get to the point where we thought we could do it, because everybody thought we were crazy to try and, you know, do additional evidence development and change academic studies, actually. And now we partner with industry in what we call hybrid studies, and we work with NICE scientific advice, and we do a critique of the phase 3 program, and then we design a phase 2b study within the network to mitigate the issues and limitations of that phase 3 study design, because we don't want that pointed out to us by NICE 5 years downstream when we can't do anything about it. Now we've gone one step even further, and we're now partnering with industry from phase 1 onwards in a collaborative environment to make sure that we've got the right evidence, not just for the UK but other strategic markets, not just clinical information but quality of life, and also patient preference data that we just don't have. And it's really the only way forward. And what we need to do is adapt the regulatory and HDE processes to be part of these early discussions, and we do things jointly.
Thank you,
sorry.
Eric.
It's
Yes,
interesting
please,
though,
Linda.
Elizabeth, that the Cancer Drugs Fund and the Early Access to Medicine Scheme, two quite big policy initiatives from government. From the Cancer Drugs Fund, and when we looked at end-of-life criteria, the first thing that was cut out was the requirement for the NHS to collect data on patients. The first thing that was cut out of the Early Access to Medicine Scheme was the requirement to collect data. Now, I understand that's people don't want to burden the NHS with it, but it's really difficult for us if we look at the new medicine and we have no idea. And this is actually on a day-to-day basis. I see another committee member in the back. On a day-to-day basis is the issue. It's not the evidence of the innovator that's the problem. It's the comparator. We have no idea what patients currently are experiencing in the NHS, bar some anecdotal responses by patients and doctors. I think that's just, you can't sell that outside of the UK. There's a lot of other countries that are very good at collecting data. And people keep throwing this away. The AAR, if they do that again and say, oh, let's not collect data because that's really, you know, that's burdensome to industry and the NHS, they're going to make the same mistake again. And we'll keep on saying no because we have no evidence for the comparator.
I agree with that, but it's also about adaptive trial design.
Sure.
And it's about thinking about trials differently, so you've got more than one comparator arm, because you can't predict the future, not least in the UK, because of the way the revolving door goes. So again, you need to collect data from real world, but you need to change the way we do clinical research and do adaptive trial design that has a range of comparators, and the trial just rolls on. So we'll never ever not have the comparator downstream, or it's much less likely that we won't have the comparator downstream.
Thank you. And I saw some other hands up there. Yes, the gentleman just behind you, Marcus. Yeah, in front of you, I should say.
Hi, hello there. I'm Ben Dodd, Neurosciences Pharmacist at Sheffield Teaching Hospitals. My day-to-day practice is often dealing with pretty rare conditions, orphan conditions, and subsequently, you know, if we're looking to get licensed drugs, often we just don't have the patients to get the trials, to do the trials, to get the license. So day-to-day, I'm often dealing with unlicensed medicines, specials, or things we import from Europe because there is no market in the UK. Now, recently we've had a couple of drugs where we've been sourcing those. They've then gone through an orphan drug program, and the cost has hiked up. So one example is 3,4-diaminopiridine for something called Lambert-Eaton myasthenic syndrome. The other one's a chenodeoxycholic acid, a drug that years ago was in the UK for gallstones. There's a rare condition called cerebrotendinous xanthomatosis. It's the only treatment for it. We used to pay £300 a year for that. We're now paying in excess of £40,000 a year. Now, in those cases, I'm struggling to see the innovation, and I'm not seeing patient benefit because it's not coming on commissioners' radars, and we're having real battles to get these patients funded. I just wonder, am I, from an industry perspective, am I missing something? Because I've become quite cynical about the whole thing, and I just wondered if you maybe could shed some light on why that's happening.
David, could you start us on this?
Well, I understand the issue. I'm not aware of, obviously, the detail. I think there are some cases where there's such limited market for products that we're increasingly seeing larger companies divest products to smaller pharmaceutical companies who then change the pricing arrangements. I think that might be part of the problem. But, in the scheme of things, and I understand it's a problem if you work in that area, in the scheme of things, it's not a big feature of costs to the system, but it is an issue in some cases.
I can understand that, but cumulatively those things, do stack up. And I guess the question I have to ask is, and I think as pharmacists, it's sort of indoctrinated into just about licensing, and it's important to have licensing. But in these cases, I don't know if because there's no additional clinical data that's gone to get the license, how has the patient clinic, I don't feel the patients necessarily have got any benefit from that. And I think there are other things in the pipeline, and except in the scheme of the grand scheme of things. But for those patients, those rare conditions, we're having some really difficult conversations because people won't pay for them.
Anyone else like to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think for me, our continued inability to understand how to bring drugs that work to small populations is the biggest tsunami that we've got, because I think even in cancer, just take myeloma, there's 10 different types of myeloma, and so you divide 4,000 patients a year by 10, and they're relatively small groups. And I think this is the thing we need to work on, is how do we do it? I don't think the industry discovery development model is set up to do it. I don't think the regulatory processes are set up to do it. I think pricing doesn't work. The way we price today clearly is not going to work 5-10 years from now, because it'll be phone numbers for drugs bills, but I'm not sure where that discussion's happening in terms of how do we fix this.
I guess, individual funding requests are something which are tortuous for everybody. They're potentially unfair depending on who comes first versus who's at the last on the list. So you want to try and take that out as much as you can. So policy is better than doing it on the hop, undoubtedly. You're right, some of these drugs are obscenely expensive with very limited reason why that should be. It's about return on investment, but some of this is also the dogma of we have to follow MHRA to get advice, which is advice. And I know some organisations have chosen not to do that and had quite a lot of stick for that, but if you're looking at £300 or £40,000 for what is ostensibly the same chemical product, and the evidence proves that it works, somebody was going to say, well, why? And my finance director would say, well, why are you doing that? So there's an element of us having to live within the system we're in, but also probably pushing out the system and saying this isn't right, we need to change it. So I think orphan drugs and the MHRA perhaps is an avenue for us collectively, and maybe the professional body, to be leading on this.
It's an interesting question, because in this highly specialized technologies program, admittedly we've only looked at 2 and we're about to appraise a third. We have so your first question was, what's value? And we don't know. We don't know how much we should pay. We have no cost per quality. So we turn the question on to the company, say, can you explain why it's reasonable to pay £250,000 per patient per year? On what basis? And we asked them the question, Election was the first one, can you show us exactly from your books how much it cost to make this medicine and how much it did cost to research and how much you're expecting to return? Now, they refused because they thought that was the wrong question to ask, and industry supported them in that. It's probably the wrong question to ask in a commercial environment of this kind, but I think it is a good test. Someone has to decide what is reasonable, and the argument needs to be reasonable. If someone just said, I took an old thing and I repurposed it and I didn't do any trials, then I would say, well, that's not reasonable. But if they have a proper argument to make, because it's gene therapy, it's really difficult, it's really cutting edge, then, and it delivers 40 qualities or 20 qualities, sure.
Any other questions?
Just again, the question about value from medicines. Obviously, Meprazole a few years ago was becoming generic, but the big company there did a trial to make 13 reasons of how they can make their patent last a little bit longer. The 13th reason was making a salt, or the RNS form of the formulation. These CEOs, they're earning tens of millions of pounds. You know, you said, Eric, when you're in the room, yes, they're probably earning a lot more than you've gone across. I must admit, again, I don't see that value for money for just extending their patency for their cash cow.
So, David, I suppose the question is, these kind of enantiomer kind of drug development projects, are they slightly cynical, you know, I mean, for the NHS? I mean, just look at them.
I think some are, but I think things have moved on a bit. I think that sort of evergreening concept that was probably perhaps a bit more common 10, 15 years ago. I think it's a lot less of that now, because I don't think varying your salt justifies.
They had 13 reasons of how to do it going across. That was their last option.
Yeah.
I think they've got other ways of trying to increase their patency of their drugs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's up to companies to justify the value of that if they're making a change of that nature. I think it's going to be a clear benefit. Otherwise, you know, I don't think anybody supports just extending things for the sake of it, for pure commercial value. There's got to be some value, because otherwise the system shouldn't have to pay for it.
The industry is being very good with biosimilars. It's quite supportive, actually, in us saying that they're just the same, but a bit cheaper. Leaving aside how you switch patients on existing medicines to biosimilars, all that I think is a prescribing debate. But for new patients to use a biosimilar instead of a kind of originator has been reasonably common ground on this. I think people do understand that the NHS has a real issue on affordability.
Anyone else have a last question? One more, the lady.
And I'm a student from Nottingham. Perhaps this is quite naive of me and probably very off tangent, but I have worked in community pharmacies at times, and I see that a lot of the patients that come in, they are exempt from the medications. It's probably say about 95% of them. And I also do see on the other end, when they bring back so much medication, a lot of it is quite expensive. There's a lot of wastage. I know obviously people are aware of that as well. And I've also seen when patients are really hoarding medications when they don't need it, or ticking off repeats again when they don't need it. So it was just a thought that occurred to me that perhaps medications could be priced in a different way to patients. So, for example, things that are necessities to patients, such as insulin or epilepsy medication, perhaps those could be freely available to patients rather than just populations of patients. And things such as short-term antibiotics, maybe that they could be priced to patients rather than, for example, just because you're under 18, you don't have to pay, or something like that, because then it might limit wastage. And perhaps, again, like I said, it might be a bit naive, but I'd like to see what you think about it, and if there is any other plans for reducing wastage with medication.
So who are you directing the question at specifically?
I'd suppose it'd probably be more directed to maybe the CCG and NICE as well.
Oh, okay, maybe Minded just start us off, and then Andrew.
This is out of my comfort zone, and he just left our associate director, who's from the Medicines Prescribing Centre. So medicines optimization isn't really my business. So I'm sorry. I think they're all valid points, though.
Maybe Andrew can help us out here.
We have a lot of patients now who, through cough and the like, we tick a lot of boxes and we give them the things that the guideline says they should get. It's not unusual for patients to have 15 or more medicines. I couldn't personally remember to take more than about 6. But I guess the question is, to turn it around, do we ever ask the patients, what's the outcome you want? As opposed to saying, here's what I'm going to give you, is that okay? That is not consent. Consent is, what's the outcome you want, and then we agree that's what we're going to do. Lely Obo, if you've heard talk recently from London, has got this cracking example of where she called up a GP and said, I'd like you to stop 16 drugs for this patient, and the GP went mad. And she said, okay, can I rephrase this? This patient isn't taking anything at all. Can you please start 6 medications? Because I've agreed whether that's what she'll agree to take. Now that is a completely different conversation, but we never actually get to the root of it. So we can put price in boxes, that isn't going to help. It's about, do I understand what I'm taking it for? And I'm truly engaged in wanting to take that for the benefit. You know, I've been diagnosed with high blood pressure. I choose not to take medication. I choose to count my steps and do something about my lifestyle. That is helping. But Other people may not have the choice, they may just give a drug. So we have a choice to explain these options to people, which might reduce the drug burden, but actually might be the thing that people actually want, because we need to ask them what they want.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So no more questions then? No? Okay, well, I think this comes to the end. I would like to thank our panel, they were great, and you as well. Thank you so much for all those questions. I suppose for me today, the debate was about not just drug prices, but the value of medicines, but how do you work that out, as Minded has been saying. So, I mean, ultimately, you know, we need to find a formula where we balance, you know, patients' needs to access affordable, innovative new treatments, but at the same time supporting innovation. So it's not an easy task. So thank you very much.
Thank you.